Hey everyone, tonight we're slipping into the cold, echoing halls of Tudor England, where a once mighty king now lies, bloated, withered, his former glory, surviving only in the portraits hanging on cold stone walls. It's the winter of 1547. The wind howls through the windows of Whitehall, and inside the air is thick with incense, a futile attempt to mask the smell of decaying flesh. At the center of that dim room lies Henry VIII, once the embodiment of English power, now no longer a warrior on horseback, but a massive, gasping figure betrayed by his own body. Courtiers whisper behind velvet curtains. Gangrenous legs ooze, and the most terrifying part? This isn't horror fiction. It's real history, bizarre, brutal, and shockingly fascinating. Trust me, you wouldn't survive a night locked inside that sick room. And before you lie down and get comfy, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. But only if you genuinely enjoy what we're doing here. Oh, and by the way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now then, turn off the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's begin tonight's journey. Henry was no longer the man who once rode on horseback with a lance in royal tournaments, no longer the prince admired across Europe for his strong frame and radiant smile. Now, in a room draped in black, he was merely a swollen body in so much pain he couldn't stand without mechanical aid. Every movement brought a scream. Every breath was a battle. And each passing night felt like a sentence waiting to be carried out. Those granted permission to enter that room, if they were lucky enough to keep their dinner down, would emerge pale-faced hands, trembling with the scent of incense, clinging to their clothes, impossible to wash away. The physicians were essentially gambling with their lives. If they failed to save the king, they risked execution for incompetence. They applied concoctions made from boiled onions, ground human bone, and opium to ease the pain. But all it did was lull him deeper into a world suspended between dream and nightmare. And the emotional pain, perhaps even worse. In his feverish delirium, Henry called out the names of those who had died by his hand. Former wives, old friends, past enemies. He mumbled tangled prayers as if bargaining with the very God he once dared to defy, the same God he had displaced when he named himself Supreme Head of the Church of England. Amid the stench of death and the groans of agony, the royal court continued to function as if nothing was wrong. Official documents still declared the king to be in good health. But the truth, death was very near. And with each passing second, Henry VIII, the man who once made all of Europe tremble, moved one step closer to a realm where power could no longer save him. And this was only the beginning of the tragic end for England's most infamous king. Close your eyes. Just imagine standing in the icy stone corridor of Whitehall. The fireplace crackles softly. Far off you hear the king's tortured cries from his sickbed. And you know this is his final night. Let this voice take you deeper into every last detail of one of the most horrific deaths in Tudor history. Still awake, good. Because now comes the truly fascinating part. You see, Henry VIII's death wasn't just the end of a man. It was a moment of imperial transition. After nearly 40 years on the throne, he didn't just change the religion of England, he changed the very size of royal coffins. Yes, you heard that right. Before, Henry, royal coffins were typically snug, elegant, and designed for more modest frames. But for Henry, they had to build one nearly twice the size of a normal man. Records state that his coffin was so wide, it required additional pallbearers, and even the lead lining couldn't prevent a corpse leakage in the church. Picture it, a solemn royal funeral, and then drip, drip fluid hits the stone floor, and a curious dog trots up to lick it. History doesn't always need a horror script. And did you know, historians still debate whether Henry truly had diabetes or a more complex metabolic disorder. Some suggest he suffered from McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic condition that causes psychiatric issues and muscle degeneration. When you consider that he once galloped with a sword and later couldn't stand unaided, it does make you wonder, doesn't it? That's the first strange truth you're hearing tonight. Henry VIII, one of the most powerful men in Europe, was once treated by having boiled onions laid on his legs, an ointment made from crushed human skull applied to his wounds. If you think modern healthcare still has its flaws, imagine your doctor walking in and saying, "I brought human skull powder, you'll feel better soon." The good news: at least you live in the 21st century. Back then, the court kept Henry's death a secret for 3 days, because they knew if the public found out, political sharks would swarm at the scent of royal blood. So they staged a power play right in the palace secret meetings, hasty promotions, and the distribution of many thick envelopes. Perhaps that's why England didn't immediately fall into chaos. A smooth transition, as modern office workers might say. But what you won't find in school books is just how much people feared his bedroom. After he died, no one wanted to stay in that room. Many swore they heard cries in the night. Many felt a strange coldness there. Even his son, Edward VI, refused to sleep in his father's bed. And you think to yourself, yeah, same here. Right now, try closing your eyes. Picture a cold stone palace incense swirling like stubborn kitchen smoke, the steady echo of guards' boots on stone floors. Then suddenly, you hear a mutter like someone whispering the name of the dead. But there's no one there. And in places that were once the heart of power, sounds don't always need the living to make themselves heard. And if you're still awake, don't worry. The story isn't over yet. You'll want to know why even after death, Henry VIII still tried to control the future of England from underground. Still with me, good. Then come with me a little deeper into a place where history isn't just recorded, it whispers in the dark. You're lying there, blanket up to your chin, and maybe you're wondering, how can a dead king still rule? Well, if you were Henry VIII, a man who burned down the church just to divorce his wife, then ruling a country post-mortem is barely a stretch. Right before he died, Henry wrote a will over 30 pages long. And no, it wasn't just leave the crown to my son. It was more like an instruction manual for England to be used when I'm no longer breathing, but still want to control everything. He spelled it out clearly. Edward first, then Mary, then Elizabeth. No one else allowed. No Lady Jane Grey, no rebels, no negotiations. Just as you suspected, he scheduled the reigns of all 3 of his children before dying. A kind of Tudor-era Google Calendar, if you will. And this is where historians begin to argue. Some say Henry was a strategic genius, ensuring the dynasty's continuation. Others claim he was so obsessed with power that he couldn't accept he wouldn't be around to oversee it. Either way, the reality is everything he wrote down eventually came true. And as you know, not every will gets that kind of success rate. Stranger still, among the many treasures and weapons found after his death, there was a small chest not filled with gold or war maps, but a tiny portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair believed to be his mother's, and a child's prayer book, possibly belonging to young Elizabeth. Hearing that, do you feel a flicker of softness in him? A king who executed 2 wives, countless subjects who seized a whole church yet kept his mother's hair wrapped safely in a box. At that moment you realize no matter how vast the power within every person, there's a small space reserved for tenderness. And his body after death. That story continues, and it doesn't get any less stomach-turning. Henry was laid out in Whitehall for 3 days before being moved to Windsor. In that time, his already infected body began to decay so quickly that servants worked non-stop to keep the room from becoming an open morgue. Incense was burned constantly, windows thrown open to let in the cold air, and perfumed cloths held to noses. The scent was described as a deadly sweetness, both alluring and nauseating. The kind of smell you catch and immediately wish you hadn't. There are even records stating that during the transport, the coffin cracked open. The lid lining, meant to prevent leaks, couldn't withstand the pressure inside. Once again, Henry made the entire court cover their noses. But do you know what's stranger than all that? Despite everything that happened, the image of Henry VIII in the English imagination remains the portrait, hands on hips, legs apart, chest puffed, stern face, a gaze that makes you feel like you owe him money and he's out of patience. A strong, nearly invincible image. No one hangs paintings of him writhing in pain or crying out names of the dead. No one paints him being hoisted upright by iron contraptions or having human skull paste rubbed on his infected legs. People only remember the glory, and that is the kind of power greater than death itself, a symbol. Are you still awake? If so, breathe slowly, deeply. Because after we've passed through the flesh, the scent, the politics, we now arrive at the most terrifying part, the soul. And Henry, even at the very end, wasn't sure where his belonged. Is the light still on? Or did you just pull the blanket a little higher? That's fine. Stay, because I'm about to tell you about the final nightmares of a king whom neither heaven nor earth could soothe. Henry VIII, once a man who roared like thunder, who sentenced others to death with a mere glance, now whispered in his sleep. Not threats, but broken prayers. Servants recounted hearing him call the name of Thomas More, once his friend, later a martyr beneath the blade Henry himself commanded. Other nights, he murmured, "Anne, don't look at me like that." And if you remember, Anne Boleyn was his second wife who lost her head when love turned into suspicion. You're lying there listening, and you wonder in the final moments, does the soul, even one encased in the armor of power, begin to melt? Were the faces Henry saw not from memory, but from beyond the door he was about to pass through? And the thing that gives you just a bit more of a chill, he didn't just see them. He spoke to them. Even when the room was empty, people heard him conversing. Whether it was pleading or justifying, no one knows. But it certainly wasn't peaceful. Historians still debate were these dying visions caused by illness, opium, or conscience. Some argue it was just pain-induced hallucination. But others, the kind who sit by the fire and tell stories when the night gets long, believe the people Henry killed came back. And here's something not many know. In his final months, Henry shifted his religious stance back and forth. Some days he requested Catholic rites, others he wanted Protestant prayers. Some say he was wavering from fear. Others shrug and say, well, when your bones are sticking out of your legs, anyone might feel the need for God. A line that's half funny, half chilling. You're still lying there, aren't you? My voice is still drifting through your ears, like the wind through an old tower. And you can picture the scene, a once invincible king, now laid out, no power left, no reverence remaining, only a rotting body, a panicked mind and dreams no doctor or priest could touch. And yet when Henry died that morning, January 28th, 1547, England didn't wail. No great funeral bells rang at once. The court stayed silent for 3 days. For 3 entire days, the most powerful man in Europe was dead, and no one dared to announce it. Why simple power must not die with the man who held it. At least not immediately. Instead, his closest courtiers quietly fortified young Edward VI's reign. They signed documents, granted titles, split influence, all while that massive body still lay cold in Whitehall, emanating a stench no incense could banish. You think this is the end? Not yet. Tonight I still have much to tell you about how an empire buried its ruler as though hiding something rather than honoring him. But for now, he'll let you breathe a little more. Inhale, exhale. And when you're ready, well, continue past the velvet-draped funeral carriages, the wax figures made in the image of the king as a young man, and one final journey to Windsor Castle, where they laid him beside the only wife he never got the chance to execute. Asleep yet, if not just close your eyes. I'm still here, and Henry is not yet at rest. You're still awake. Good, because now we come to the final stretch of this journey, but it's not the peaceful ending you might have hoped for. No, this is a funeral that's both grand and grim. February 16th, 1547. The skies over London were grey, the wind slicing through the cobbled streets. People lined the roads not out of grief, but curiosity. A procession of black-draped horses pulled a massive coffin, specially reinforced to bear the weight of a king who had once reached nearly 400 pounds. That funeral didn't just carry a corpse. It carried a whole era, a monument of power now decaying by the day. A life-sized wax effigy was placed atop the coffin, a youthful Henry. Standing tall, legs apart, hands on hips, as if judging the world itself. That image, that's what people wanted to remember. No one spoke of the ruptured corpse or the soaked linens beneath. They chose to believe in the strongest king, even as reality seeped out from under the lid. Did you know when they brought him to St. George Chapel at Windsor Castle, they laid him next to Jane Seymour, his third wife, the only one who gave him a son, and the only one who died before he had a chance to hate her. A love immortalized not by romance, but by timing. A little dark, I know, but very Tudor, don't you think? And then the tomb door closed. Henry VIII, who had shaken all of Europe, split the church, beheaded wives, and defied the Pope, now rested in darkness beside a woman he may have once loved, or at least never lived long enough to resent. But the strange thing is, once his body lay still, his image roared louder than ever. The court commissioned portraits, carved statues, wrote epics, and forged legends. No one mentioned the ulcerated legs, the unraveling mind, or the nights spent groaning under the weight of guilt. No, they remembered Henry, the bold Henry, the mighty Henry, the unyielding. What do you see now? A king caught between two worlds. On one side, medieval monarchy, divine rule, bloodlines, fear. On the other, a New England printing press's reformist ideas and uprisings in the name of freedom. Henry didn't fully belong to either. He died at their crossroads, and maybe that's why his death still haunts and fascinates us. Centuries later, when they reopened the tomb during renovations, they found a massive skeleton. Deformed leg bones, worn-down knee joints, traces of decades of pain. Perhaps also the physical toll of carrying an empire on one's back. Are you growing tired? Is your body starting to sink under the weight of your blanket? That's a good sign. Because the last thing I want to tell you tonight is something most people forget. That after all the power, glory, and rot, Henry VIII was still just a man. A man afraid of dying, afraid of being forgotten. And in the end, he tried to hold on to everything with documents, with his image, with one feeble hand reaching toward the heavens. Are you holding someone's hand, or just clutching a pillow? No matter what I hope tonight, you feel safer, more at ease than a king who once thought himself immortal. Because at least you don't need a crown to deserve a peaceful sleep. Rest now. And if you're still awake, I'm still here. But if you've drifted into dreams, then may you dream things that never need to be written into history books. You might think power is what makes someone immortal. But sometimes what truly keeps a person alive in memory are their relationships. The ones they loved, the ones they lost, the ones they destroyed. And if you thought Henry's death was dramatic, just wait until you hear about his family life, where love, hatred, and politics wove together like an embroidered velvet curtain torn at the corners in shadow. The family life of Henry VIII, who he loved, who he killed, who he remembered. You can lie still and imagine a young king, strong, handsome, considered the dream man of 16th century Europe. That was Henry VIII in his 20s. Back then, he didn't seem like a tyrant, but more like a knight stepped out of a fairy tale. Too bad this fairy tale has way too many chapters, ending with an executioner's axe. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was a Spanish princess widow of Henry's older brother and the woman he lived with for over 20 years. Sounds stable, but it was this marriage that planted the seed for one of the biggest schisms in Western religious history. Catherine bore many children, but only one survived Mary. Henry needed a son. In fact, he was obsessed. And when Catherine passed childbearing age, Henry didn't accept the simple truth of that's just fate. No, he believed God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. So he decided to take God's place. He asked the Pope to annul the marriage. The Pope refused. Henry then created his own church to get a divorce. Yes, you heard that right. When most people are denied a bureaucratic procedure, they look for a loophole. Henry's solution: he'll invent a new religion. The result? The Church of England was born, and Catherine, the first wife companion of his youth, was banished. No more throne, no more title of queen, and eventually no more contact with her daughter. By then, Henry had fallen for Anne Boleyn, a clever, sharp-witted woman who refused to be easy. Anne knew the political game and made Henry chase her. When he married her, he believed he had touched destiny. But then Anne gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth, followed by several miscarriages. Henry's disappointment grew, and love turned into suspicion. One day he accused Anne of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. Anne was executed. When she climbed the scaffold, she wore gray and prayed. No screams, no resistance. And perhaps in that moment, amidst the crowd and the pounding of war drums, Henry was somewhere thinking about a belly that had failed to deliver a king. If you're thinking, it can't get worse, then you haven't met wife number 3, Jane Seymour. She was the only one who gave birth to a son, Edward. But the price was, she died from postnatal bleeding. For the first time, Henry wore black for weeks. He didn't remarry immediately. He gave Jane a royal funeral, something none of his other wives received. You see, the only woman who escaped tragedy was the one who died before she could disappoint him. Then came Anne of Cleves, wife number 4, a marriage arranged for political alliance. But when Henry met her in person, he was shocked that she didn't look like her portrait. He called her the Flanders mare. The marriage lasted only 6 months, then was annulled. No one died this time. Lucky break. The 5th wife, Catherine Howard, was a young, impulsive girl who actually did commit adultery. By then, Henry was obese and in constant pain, and he had her executed without hesitation. When Catherine was led away, she cried and screamed, a stark contrast to Anne's composure. It's said she asked to rehearse her execution beforehand, so she wouldn't tremble too much when the real moment came. The final wife, Catherine Parr, was the only one to survive Henry. An educated, gentle woman, wise enough to not make Henry angry. She cared for him like a nurse tends a patient, and quietly took on the role of teacher to his 3 children. After Henry died, she quickly remarried an old flame. A plot twist so abrupt, even history had to pause and catch its breath. And Henry's children, survivors of the storm. You're lying there, eyes half closed, and maybe you're thinking, but what about the children? Henry had 3 legitimate children who survived Mary Elizabeth Edward, each from a different mother. And ironically, each one of them had at some point been rejected by their father, only to later wear the crown. Edward VI. The beloved son reigned for just 6 years before dying of tuberculosis. A bright but fragile boy. His legacy was pushing Protestant reforms, something Henry himself never fully committed to. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, came to the throne next. A devout Catholic queen who burned hundreds of Protestants alive. They called her Bloody Mary. Perhaps deep down, she was still trying to prove my father was wrong, to cast my mother and me aside. Elizabeth, a daughter of Anne Boleyn, ruled the longest and most successfully. A lifelong unmarried woman. Sharp, resilient, always reminding her court, I am the daughter of Henry VIII. A way of saying, I know betrayal, and I will not be easily swayed. Now you've heard who Henry VIII loved, hated, executed, and remembered. But if you think his life was just a royal soap opera with daggers and candle wax, then you've only scratched the surface. Because the truth is, Henry didn't just leave behind a tangled family, he left policies that reshaped all of England, from throne to farmer, from cathedral to market square. And if the previous section made you drowsy, this part might help you sleep even deeper. But not because it's boring. Rather because, like a medieval political symphony, it carries the rhythm of power, steel decrees, and a touch of paranoia. Henry VIII's policies, how one man remade a nation in his own image. You're lying in bed hearing my voice in steady rhythm, and maybe you picture Henry as a king who ruled with a whip. But really, Henry wasn't just a man who executed wives and yelled at doctors. He was a man who redesigned the entire political, religious, and legal system of England simply to suit his personal emotions. Yes, that was policy. Partly for the nation, and partly because this works better for me. Breaking from the Catholic Church, the boldest religious policy of the medieval era. It all started with love and ended in schism. Henry couldn't produce a male heir with his first wife, Catherine. He believed this was God punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. When the Pope refused to annul the marriage, Henry said, "That's fine, I don't need the Pope anymore." Imagine it like this: you try to cancel a subscription and get denied, so you create an entirely new platform. Then you force everyone else to use it with you. The result. In 1534, Henry issued the Act of Supremacy, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. Not the Pope, not even God, just him. Historians still debate whether Henry truly intended religious reform, or if he just wanted a new wife without risking excommunication. Regardless of the reason, this policy triggered a religious transformation that would reshape the nation for centuries. Dissolution of the monasteries. Funding the crown with faith. After breaking from the church, Henry had a conveniently inspired idea: seize the entire wealth of Catholic monasteries. From 1536 to 1541, over 800 monasteries, abbeys, and priories were shut down and their assets confiscated. Gold, art, rare books, land all became royal property. Some of it was sold off to fund wars and build palaces. Some was handed to loyal nobles, a not-so-subtle way of buying silence. If you've ever heard of financial restructuring in modern economics, this was the Tudor version, brutal but extremely effective. Military and navy Henry's dream of a maritime empire. Few know that Henry VIII laid the foundations for the Royal Navy, the very force that would one day rule the seas. He commissioned dozens of warships, built armories, and founded the dockyard at Portsmouth. He was also the first to establish a formal sailor payroll system, rather than relying solely on noble-led fleets. Some historians say Henry just liked big ships and sailing. But you can't deny it, his military investments launched Britain's age of maritime dominance, redefining loyalty with a blade. Henry didn't like opposition, and his national policy made that brutally clear. Throughout his reign, he executed over 70,000 people, including close friends, cardinals, wives, nobles, scholars, and commoners. He enacted the treason by thought law, meaning you didn't have to act treasonously. Thinking differently was enough to lose your head. Yes, you heard that right. Not doing anything wrong. Just thinking the wrong thing. Imagine living in that world. You're eating a tart frown slightly next day. No mouth to frown with. Under Henry, loyalty wasn't a feeling, it was a survival requirement. 5. Monetary policy, an economy as unstable as his pulse. Henry spent a lot of money, and when the treasury ran dry, he came up with a solution: debase the currency. Instead of minting coins with pure silver, he added cheaper metals, creating more coins without needing more silver. Sound familiar? Yes, it was 16th century inflation. The result, people lost trust and money prices soared, and by the end of his reign, Henry left his son with a nearly bankrupt economy. 6. Education and law, Henry's dream of learn first, rebel never. Henry founded several educational institutions and supported the printing of books in English. but he also passed harsh religious censorship laws. You were encouraged to read the Bible, but only the version he approved. You were allowed to learn, but not to debate. A clever way to produce a public bright enough to obey, but not bright enough to dissent. Henry VIII was the embodiment of political paradox, a reformer and a tyrant, the father of modern England and the seed of future civil wars. His policies were not always for the people, but always served one thing, his will. And now, as you lie there, breath-slowing, eyelids heavy, you begin to realize perhaps the scariest thing isn't policy, but how one man can bend an entire country to fit the shape of his unstable heart. Sleep well. And if you dream of a crowned king holding a map, smiling and saying, "Here's the new law, don't be too alarmed. As long as you don't object, you'll keep your head." You lie there, soft lamplight, spilling through a thin curtain, the fan turning gently like the breath of a sleeping cat. And you think history ends when someone dies. No. When Henry VIII drew his final breath, he left behind not just a massive corpse and an incense-choked funeral, but a political and religious aftershock his daughter Elizabeth I would wrestle with her entire life. You can imagine Elizabeth as an heir full of contradiction. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded by Henry himself. She grew up labeled the daughter of an illegitimate marriage. Then suddenly, after Henry's death, she was placed back into the line of succession as if no one had ever lost their head, because her father changed his mind. So when Elizabeth took the throne in 1558, she wasn't just a queen. She was the living symbol of Henry's legacy, a legacy she could neither deny nor fully embrace. The first policy Elizabeth faced was religion, the deepest wound Henry had left in England's soul. When Henry declared himself head of the Church of England, he didn't consider what future generations would have to endure. After Henry came Edward VI, a staunch Protestant. Then Mary, the Catholic daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who burned hundreds alive to restore Roman faith. And after all, that Elizabeth, daughter of a heretic yet not extreme enough to kill, had to find a middle way. You might imagine that pressure like trying to wear one coat for both summer and winter. And Elizabeth, with an almost instinctual brilliance, did something no one expected. She didn't choose a side. She redefined the center. The Act of Supremacy, 1559, issued by Elizabeth, reaffirmed that the Queen was the head of the Church of England. But this time she chose her words carefully. Supreme Governor, not Supreme Head. A way of saying, yes, I rule, but I don't overstep God. And instead of forcing everyone to choose between Protestantism and Catholicism, Elizabeth cleverly endorsed a Protestant form with Catholic-like rituals, leaving both sides dissatisfied but not rebellious. You see, that was Elizabeth's style to please no one completely, but just enough to keep everyone alive. And Henry's influence ran deeper than you think. In his time, treason meant hanging, disembowelment, and beheading. In Elizabeth's time, that legacy still breathed, but she used it more as a warning than a sentence. When facing Catholic uprisings, assassination plots, and foreign conspiracies, Elizabeth always appeared tolerant until she couldn't be. And when she struck, it was with a cold precision, a skill she had learned in part from her father. It's no coincidence that Elizabeth never married. Many historians say she feared losing power. But if you look deeper, you'll see she grew up in a court where marriage meant death. A mother beheaded stepmothers, executed or discarded aunts, exiled. To Elizabeth, love was a dagger with a golden hilt. She chose solitude and made the entire court accept it. And don't forget Henry's financial legacy, an empty treasury after he burned through funds on wars and construction. Elizabeth, inheriting a nearly bankrupt crown, had to keep the court on a tight budget for years. She cut expenses, wore old dresses, negotiated every tax. But more importantly, she understood one truth. power doesn't just lie in issuing decrees, it lies in making people believe in them. Under Elizabeth Henry's, religious policies were stabilized. His naval ambitions, remember those ships he loved so much, became the backbone of England's victory over the Spanish Armada. His harsh laws, once seen as cruel, now laid the foundation for a more stable legal system. Whether she wanted to or not, Elizabeth took the fragments of her father's reign and assembled a kingdom that not only survived, but shone. And do you think she did it with sweetness? Not at all. She once declared, "I have the heart and stomach of a king, and not just any king, but a king of England." Sound familiar? That's Henry's voice echoing from the dungeons of her memory. Because though she differed from her father in finesse and gentler governance at her core, she was still his blood. Picture Elizabeth walking through the cold stone corridors of the old palace, where her father once roared like thunder, once signed the execution of her mother. Perhaps each footstep echoed a choice: I will continue what my father began, but I will not repeat his mistakes. And there in silence, she ruled. Nearly 45 years. Twice as long as her father. Never married, never overthrown. And when she died, the people wept as if a whole era had vanished. An era built on the ashes of Henry VIII's contradictions. Are you still awake? If so, you've just walked with me through decades of political aftershocks, from velvet thrones to icy hallways. And if you're already asleep, that's fine too. Because those policies, whether your eyes are open or not, still shape the world we live in today. From who can get divorced, to how far the state can reach into the church, to how far a woman can rule. Henry VIII is dead, but his political legacy still breathes. Sleep well. And if tomorrow you wake from a dream where you're being interrogated in a Tudor courtroom, just remember, don't look too clever. And don't object unless you know exactly who's on the throne. Still there, good. Because now, having explored his policies, his religious scars, and the echoes his daughter inherited, let's take another path. A road not paved with marble tiles, but with mud blood and banners flapping in the wind. This is where Henry VIII is no longer a father or a lawmaker. He is a king burning with hunger for glory through war. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. You're standing in a desolate field in northern France, where war drums beat like the pulse of an empire. Wind sweeps over armor horses, shriek the scent of smoke, and steel mixes in the air. And at the center of it all is Henry. Not the bloated old man on his deathbed, but a towering young figure clad in gleaming armor, dreaming of fame his father, Henry VII, never earned. If his father laid the foundations of stability, Henry VIII wanted to build his palace from conquest. The first battlefield he chose was France, a traditional choice. After all, the English had long treated fighting the French as something of a national sport. In 1513, just a few years after taking the throne, Henry led his army across the Channel, declaring his intent to restore English claims to the French crown, a dream once held by the Plantagenet kings. And you know what? Henry actually won the Battle of the Spurs, capturing several French nobles and seizing the towns of Tournai and Rouen. The court erupted in applause, music played, poems praised his victory. And for a fleeting moment, Henry felt like a new Alexander. But following the high of triumph came the ledgers. The campaign was so costly that both the treasury and the people bore its burden. Tournai, one of the cities he had taken, was later sold back to France for a bargain price. A beautifully spun tale in history books, but a terrible return on investment. And that same year, while Henry played the warrior in France, his wife Catherine of Aragon stayed in England and won a bigger battle. When King James IV of Scotland invaded from the north, yes, the Queen ordered troops to defeat him at the Battle of Flodden, where James was killed and the Scottish army scattered. A gentle slap to Henry's military ego. While he swung his sword in France, his wife was defending the kingdom from the back halls of the palace. Did Henry give up? Of course not. A few years later, he went to war again. But by then, the political landscape had changed. Alliances shifted like a card game. One year, Henry allied with the Germans. The next, he made peace with Spain. One year, he fought France. The next, he arranged a marriage alliance with them. One especially famous moment was the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, where Henry met King Francis I of France in what became the most extravagant royal meeting in history. They didn't fight, they wrestled, feasted, and set up tents lined with gold. It was called diplomacy. In reality, it was a who's richer contest. And like all contests of that kind, money flew away like swallows in spring. Once again, Henry looked majestic, but the treasury drained ever further. However, the longest, most expensive, and most personal campaign Henry ever launched was against Scotland. After his first wife fell from his heart, her native Spain was no longer a close ally. Henry turned his anger northward. After Flodden, he tried to assert control over Scottish politics through his daughter Mary. But the Scots didn't cooperate, leading to a series of campaigns known as the Rough Wooing. Yes, you heard that right, a decade-long war called a wooing. Henry launched raids, burned villages, looted towns, all to force Scotland into marrying young Mary to his son Edward, the boy he had with Jane Seymour. And of course, as with any courtship by sword, the plan failed completely. Mary Stuart would go on to become Queen of Scots, and a major thorn in the side of his daughter Elizabeth. And can you guess what connected all these campaigns? It wasn't just ambition. It was an insatiable hunger for glory. Henry didn't go to war to expand the realm long-term or to defend borders in the usual sense. He fought to prove he was a king of victories because his father had never stepped onto a battlefield. And though he once claimed victories, captured towns, feasted on enemy soil. In the end, there was no land he held for long. Those campaigns were costly, bloody, and ultimately sold back abandoned or reconciled. But don't think that made Henry a failure. No, in his mind, every war was a painting of propaganda. And incredibly, portraits of him wielding a sword astride a white horse still hang in castles to this day. And you know what? Though few say it aloud, those very campaigns deepened the financial troubles that led him to dissolve the monasteries, debase the currency, and lay the groundwork for the crises Elizabeth would later have to clean up. Now picture this. A man overweight, suffering from leg ulcers, possibly with heart disease, still insisting on wearing armor and leading troops for the sake of honor. A king willing to burn through fortunes for a few glorious days on the battlefield, only to return to a pile of invoices taller than his throne. A man who could never reconcile with the idea of being seen as less than other kings, other fathers, other times. You're listening to this in soft light, your breath steady, and you realize sometimes we don't fight because we must, but because we can't bear to be forgotten. Henry fought many battles. Some he won, most he lost all, were expensive. But in the memory of history, he remains a king, in iron boots, riding a white horse, swinging a sword across Europe. Even if in truth he may have been hoisted onto the saddle by a pulley because his legs couldn't lift him, asleep yet. If not, you've just walked through a smoke-filled chapter. Not to worry, but to understand even the grandest wars sometimes begin in a restless heart. Sleep more peacefully than Henry ever did. And if you wake tomorrow dreaming of yourself in armor, riding off to war in France, roll over. Fighting's exhausting. You're lying still, lamplight spilling through a sheer curtain. And maybe you're thinking, Henry VIII, a mighty king living in a splendid palace with 6 wives and countless thrones. Yes, that's true. But while the king sat choosing silk colors in Whitehall, there were millions outside who couldn't even choose their next meal. People who wore no brocade, rode no warhorse, signed no edicts, only bent over soil, breathed in morning mist, and prayed the crops wouldn't betray them. That was the life of the English peasant under Henry VIII. And tonight, as your eyes begin to close, he'll tell you about that silent, thorny life, not to trouble your sleep, but to remind you that if you're lying on a soft mattress listening through a smart device, you're living better than 95% of England in 1535. During Henry's reign, the vast majority of people were peasants. They didn't have the last name Tudor. They didn't sit in Parliament. They had no say in the Reformation or the war with France. They only knew harvests, taxes, and God in that order. They lived in timber-framed homes, thatched with straw with earthen floors. No electricity, no clean water. And if it rained too much, sorry, your house floor turned into a swamp within 3 days. You think winter's cold? They had no central heating, just a hearth in the middle of the room and the entire family, parents, children, chickens, dogs, sometimes even a cow huddled around it. Not for romance, for survival. Every winter was a battle against the elements. And if summer brought hunger, winter might bring death. You eat 3 meals a day. They had 1. Usually porridge or black bread so dense that if dropped it might crack a toe. Meat was a rare luxury saved for feast days. And vegetables, not your clean organic kind. Whatever grew nearby, watercress, turnips, onions, and often more worm than plant. So what did they live for? The answer: faith land and fragile hope. To a peasant, land was everything. But the land wasn't theirs. It belonged to the lords or to the church. They merely rented it or worked as tenants, meaning they handed over most of the harvest to their masters and kept just enough to feed their families. Every harvest was a mental battle. Is there enough to eat? What's left after taxes? The cow is sick. How will we plow this year? Did Henry know? Yes, and he taxed them often, 2, 3, even 4 times a year. Beyond land taxes, there were church taxes, market taxes, marriage taxes, even a window tax. Yes, if you had more windows than others, you paid more. Then came the strange moment in 1536, when Henry began dissolving the monasteries, seizing church lands and selling them to the nobility. Suddenly, thousands of peasants lost their land, their jobs, and their spiritual refuge. The monastery had been a place to get bread, to pray, to find herbs and healing. Now they were shut, smashed statues, broken monks driven out. A wave of fury spread across the north. And then all at once came the pilgrimage of grace. Over 30,000 peasants and devout citizens marched to demand the restoration of the monasteries and an end to the king's reforms. Henry pretended to negotiate. And then, yes, you guessed it, ordered the execution of hundreds. Many were hanged on the very soil they had once sowed. A bitter kind of harvest. And if you think only men suffered, think again. Peasant women were farmers, mothers, nurses, bakers, and sometimes the ones blamed if a chicken died for no clear reason. They gave birth with no clinics, cleaned homes without soap, and aged quickly. A woman at 35 might already be toothless, hunched, and raising her 5th child. Children, no schools, just fields. By age 7, they worked herding sheep, guarding crops, carrying water. If lucky, they might learn a few letters at church. If not, they simply grew up to become peasants, just like their parents. You're breathing more slowly now. Good, because by this point you begin to see, no matter how many times the king divorced, no matter how many wars were declared, the peasants still plowed, harvested, paid taxes, and prayed the weather wouldn't kill them before the crown could. They lived not because they were protected, but because they knew how to survive. And strangely enough, they were the ones feeding the entire kingdom. While King Henry issued edicts on church and conquest, the soup in his bowl still came from hands that didn't know how to spell his name. Tonight, as you sleep beneath warm covers, think of the woman stoking a fire with dry grass in a stone hut in Yorkshire, 1540. Think of the shepherd boy in the mist of Norfolk, bare feet in the mud, never having seen a city. Think of the ones who lived, worked, loved, birthed, and died, and whom no history books remember. And if you sleep, sleep deeply, because at least you don't have to wake at 4 a.m. to collect rainwater, split firewood, and wonder if this year's crops will fail again. Sleep now. The peasants of Henry VIII's time never truly rested. But you can. You've heard about the wars, the policies, the quiet struggles of peasants under Henry VIII. But if you're still there, eyes half closed, head resting softly on your pillow, then it'll take you one step further. Not to the battlefield, not to the fields of toil, but into the very center of power. In 16th century England, the political system under Henry VIII, where everything was arranged like a giant chessboard, and the king was the only player allowed to change the rules at will. Think politics today is complicated. Imagine a time when laws were only valid if the king said so. Everything orbited around Henry like the sun, and everyone around him, from courtiers to nobles, were fragile little planets desperate to shine, terrified of being burned. Under Henry VIII, England's political system wasn't quite the modern democracy we know, nor was it a purely feudal monarchy. It was a hybrid blending ancient rituals, absolute royal power, and the first glimmers of a professional legal system. In theory, England was an absolute monarchy. The king held supreme authority. Henry didn't need Parliament to issue decrees. He could sign execution orders, change laws, even change the national religion with a flick of his hand. And he did. When the Pope refused his divorce, Henry didn't sue. He divorced the Pope. But here's the interesting part. Henry didn't eliminate Parliament. On the contrary, he used it cleverly to legalize his own authority. Parliament at the time wasn't a forum for free debate. It had two houses, the House of Lords made up of nobles and bishops, and the House of Commons representing localities, mostly wealthy landowners. But both houses were subject to the king. Henry convened Parliament mostly when he needed money for war with France, or for building the navy, or when he wanted to formalize decisions he had already made. For example, the Act of Supremacy in 1534, declaring Henry as the head of the Church of England. He didn't just impose it, he wrote the law, passed it through Parliament, and then made the entire nation swear allegiance. It was a brilliant political strategy force agreement, then call it consent. But every king needs enforcers. And that's where courtiers, ministers, and officials came in. Henry was shrewd in choosing those who served him and unflinching in discarding them when needed. Remember Thomas Wolsey, a powerful cardinal who effectively ruled England for more than a decade in Henry's name. But when Wolsey failed to persuade the Pope to allow the divorce, he fell from grace, had his property seized, and died in disgrace. Then came Thomas More, the famous humanist, once a close friend of the king. But when he refused to recognize Henry as the supreme head of the church, he was beheaded, not for an action, just for his silence. And then there was Thomas Cromwell, one of the sharpest political minds in England at the time. It was Cromwell who helped Henry redesign the entire administrative system, managing the land seized from the church, building a more centralized and efficient government with committees and specialized departments. A major step toward modern state governance. But even Cromwell, after arranging Henry's failed marriage to Anne of Cleves, couldn't escape his fate. One day he was the king's most powerful right hand. The next, he lost his head. See what the political system was like? No safe zones, no secure seats. With the king, you had everything. Displease him, you lost your life. Henry also established the Privy Council, a small group of trusted courtiers to prevent power from falling into the hands of a single figure like Wolsey or Cromwell. Each member had a clear role: finance, war, religion, diplomacy. They worked tirelessly because they knew one mistake and they'd leave their chair on a stretcher. And don't forget, the entire system operated under the shadow of the greatest religious schism in English history. When Henry broke from the Catholic Church, he didn't just create a new faith, he placed the entire legal, religious, and social administration beneath the throne. The church was no longer a balancing power. It became a state agency cloaked in sacredness. Every cleric had to swear loyalty. Every citizen had to attend services in the way the king dictated. To disobey was treason, was heresy, and possibly a death sentence. Are you hearing this clearly? In this quiet darkness, you might picture a cold stone palace where councils once gathered by candlelight, whispering policies because any word that slipped beyond those walls could become evidence of treason. And you can imagine Elizabeth, his daughter, sitting on the throne years later, still using that same political model, a privy council, a tightly controlled parliament, a legal system revolving around the crown, but with more finesse. She knew when to soften. But the foundation of power beneath her feet was one Henry VIII had built in blood. Now, as you lie still, you understand a political system isn't just something from textbooks. It is a web of people, of ambitions, of oaths, and sometimes of screams, sealed behind stone walls. Henry did not leave behind a democracy, but he left behind a framework, rigid, efficient, and terrifying. A framework that England would keep reshaping, revising, and ultimately use to shape an empire. Sleep now. Modern politics might give you a headache, but politics under Henry VIII could cost you your head. Still with me? Good, because if you've heard about the wars, the policies, the executions behind palace walls, then perhaps now is the time we step into another room. No swords, no fanfare, just parchment seals and the hands that signed or sentenced. This is where the law under Henry VIII was born. And if you think law exists to protect justice, then lie very still. Because tonight's tale may make you realize, under a king like Henry, the law was not something you'd want to trust when pulled from bed at midnight. Before Henry, England had a fairly stable legal system rooted in custom tradition and deeply influenced by canon law. But when Henry VIII came to power, a man both brilliant and paranoid, and absolutely allergic to refusal law, ceased to be a shield of justice. It became a political weapon, a blade sharpened by language aimed directly at anyone who displeased him. Henry ruled for nearly 40 years. And in that time, he reshaped English law in ways no one had imagined, a legal system that placed the king above even God. That's not exaggeration. Because when he declared himself head of the Church of England, he effectively placed centuries of religious, spiritual, and legal authority under his throne. Imagine today you're charged with heresy for being Protestant. Next week, you're beheaded for being Catholic. Why? Because the king changed his mind, and so the law changed with him. One of the most defining acts was the Act of Supremacy in 1534. It declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. This wasn't just a religious matter, it was a legal revolution. It placed every priest, bishop, and the entire church, once a rival power, under the direct control of the crown. Disagree, that's treason. Not heresy, not dissent. Treason, and therefore a capital crime. And he meant it. Remember Thomas More, the old friend, brilliant thinker, author of Utopia, A Dream of Justice and Ideal Society. He was executed not for action, but for refusing to swear loyalty to the Act of Supremacy. Beheaded for silence. That was the law under Henry. Doing nothing could be a crime. Saying nothing could be a sentence. He also expanded the definition of treason to the point where simply saying, writing, or even dreaming something disloyal could bring death. Records tell of a carpenter who was arrested for letting his face show disapproval as the king passed by. And the scariest part? It wasn't a joke. Historians call it the era of emotional law. Henry didn't believe in limits. If a law didn't exist, he invented it. If a law got in his way, he tore it down. And if someone cited the old law, he charged them under the new one. Then, in his final years, as his body decayed and his mind sank into paranoia and fear of betrayal, he issued a series of secret statutes, executions, without trial, property seizures, without proof. The nobility trembled. Courtiers whispered prayers. Everyone knew the law was no longer a shield. It was a scythe. Remember Thomas Cromwell? The man who built Henry's entire reform machinery redesigned the legal system, dismantled the monasteries, balanced the budget, managed the kingdom's assets. But one failed marriage arrangement between Henry and Anne of Cleves, and Cromwell became a walking indictment. He was charged with treasonous conspiracy without trial, beheaded. Clean, terrifying. The law wasn't just used to maintain social order. It was a fence around the throne with only one gate and one keyholder. Henry. And yet, it must be said in those edicts signed in ink and sometimes in blood were seeds of modern law. Under Henry, administrative bodies became more specialized: finance, legal affairs, foreign relations. Legal procedures began to be recorded and systematized, the early framework of what would later become common law England's distinctive legal tradition. And here's something few notice. Henry encouraged the use of English in legal documents. Previously, most were in Latin, unreadable to ordinary people. When laws were written in the common tongue, the public began to understand and fear them more clearly. You're lying there, hearing me speak of law like the steady tapping of fingers on an old wooden desk. And perhaps you're feeling a little chill, because you realize a legal system can be both a triumph and a tool of tyranny, depending on who sits at the head of the table. Henry VIII left no constitution, but he left behind a lesson: when one person holds the power to write and rewrite laws at will, justice becomes an illusion, beautiful but fragile. So now sleep. Because if you lived in the 16th century, you might have been interrogated just for mishearing a royal decree. But today you only need to close your eyes and know that modern law, though imperfect, is still a far cry from the days when a sad look could be a capital crime. Have you ever thought about the cost of an era where the king wasn't just the ruler, but the ultimate decider of what was right? Where the law wasn't written to restrain power, but to protect it from being restrained. That is the model Henry VIII built, and it cast a long shadow over every ruler who came after. His daughter Elizabeth is remembered as a wise and prudent monarch, still ruled within the powerful legal framework her father had left behind. She reigned in a system where laws could be changed by royal decree, and where treason could still be redefined by a single displeasing remark. But she, unlike her father, used that power to maintain balance, not to settle scores. And you know what? It was precisely because Elizabeth skillfully preserved that legal framework that England avoided many of the bloody civil wars that ravaged Europe. Sometimes fear can maintain order, even if not by trust. However, one cannot forever avoid the truth. A law without limits will always demand a price. By the time Henry's descendants, the Tudors, and then the Stuarts inherited his legacy, they had to face that reckoning. Remember Charles I, a later king who thought he could rule like Henry VIII, but in the 17th century. He too sought to issue decrees, impose beliefs, and bend law to his will. The result, civil war. And one day, Charles was executed by the very legal system he believed he controlled. So you see, don't you, the shadow Henry left behind wasn't a specific set of laws, but the idea that law could be bent to serve power rather than to restrain it. And when times changed, that shadow became the seed of conflict between royal authority and civil rights, between the crown and parliament. Yet from that shadow, England began a long journey toward the idea of rule of law government, by laws, not rulers. And ironically, that progress was driven by the haunting memory of Henry VIII's reign. There's one more thing, a quieter truth, less often told. It's about how law quietly began to shape the lives of ordinary people. After Henry nationalized the church, dissolved the monasteries, and brought religious courts under his control, issues like divorce, inheritance, child custody, and even land disputes began to be handled in civil courts rather than by judgments of God. This laid the foundation for the rise of modern civil law in England, with secular courts, legal documentation, and written procedures. You could say that in a divine frenzy of control, Henry accidentally laid the first brick in England's modern judicial system. And even though most people at the time couldn't read the law, couldn't grasp legal principles, they began to understand one thing. Everything was now on paper. There were written laws to accuse, written documents to process. A judge presiding, even if appointed by the king. A strange kind of stability amid chaos, like church bells still ringing each morning, even after the monasteries were gone. Are you drifting off to sleep now? If you are, let me lull you with one final image. Picture a long table made of old oak. On it rest thick law books, some pages faded by time, others still stained with wax from a trial in 1542. Behind the table sits a solemn judge weighing a land dispute. And far in the background, the silhouette of a large man, eyes deep and unyielding, whispering, "The law is mine." But then time passed. The lawmakers faded away. The kings returned to dust. Only the law truly remained. And you, the one listening in the middle of the night, now live in a world where laws are no longer as arbitrary as they once were. A world where you can speak up, where silence is no longer a crime, where the law is no longer written in fear, but in the hope that justice might one day be a foundation for every human being. Sleep well. And if you dream of standing in a courtroom in the 16th century, remember, don't argue with the king. Just bow your head and hope he's in a good mood. If not, hopefully you'll wake up right back in this century. Still awake, good. Because now, after hearing about war's laws and even the meals of Henry VIII's peasants, he'll tell you about something else less glamorous than a throne, less bloody than a courtroom, but tied to every breath of ordinary folk transportation. Don't expect anything complicated. No highways, no GPS, no traffic lights, and certainly no gridlock on Westminster Bridge. Transportation under Henry VIII was an experience that if you ever lived in that time, you'd wish for strong legs or a patient donkey. You might imagine Tudor England like a crumpled cloth. Roads were faint lines, rough, muddy, slippery, and completely unpaved. Except for a few royal routes near major castles, most were dirt paths, or more accurately, mud year-round. If you traveled during the rainy season, and in England, when isn't it rainy, you'd wrestle with wheels sinking in mud, horses slipping, and carts breaking just outside the inn. Some stretches were padded with logs, stones, or even garbage just to get through without sinking up to your knees. What did you ride if you were noble? You had a horse, a carriage, maybe even a litter. But if you were common, you walked. Or if lucky, borrowed a donkey or an ox cart. Average speed about 5 km, meaning if you wanted to reach the next town 30 kilometers away, prepare for a full day of walking and maybe 2 pairs of straw shoes in reserve. Still, even at a slow pace, you could be splashed with waste. Because there were no lanes. Carriages, pedestrians, pigs, chickens, children, trash and household waste all shared the same road. Rain washed it, sun dried it, and wind carried it right back up. Every step was a sensory adventure. Big cities, even better. In London, main roads were cobbled but narrow, crowded, and full of stench. Carriages jammed, street vendors shouted, dogs darted everywhere, and there were no sidewalks. Step an inch off course, and you could have your heel crushed by a wheel, or your cloak soaked in a bucket of waste. And you ask, were there traffic laws? Oh yes. But they were rather flexible. Some decrees banned carriage races in the city, outlawed donkeys running too fast, and required gatekeepers to wash the road before sunrise. But in practice, the strongest went first. The weaker stepped aside. Would you like to go far, perhaps? But be prepared, there were no detailed maps. You had to ask for directions, follow landmarks like an oak tree, a church, or a rock shaped like a frog, even if no one was really sure it existed. You could also travel by river, a smoother option. The Thames was the lifeline of transportation. Wooden boats, barges, tow ferries, all carried goods, grain, ale, the elderly, and political rumors from town to village. Many nobles and clergy preferred river routes to avoid bumpy roads and highwaymen. Yes, highwaymen, a thriving profession at the time, especially in forest paths or desolate passes. A gentleman traveling alone with a pouch of gold would do best not to travel. Otherwise, you might travel by post. But be careful. Not everyone had the right to send letters. The postal system then mainly served the king and court. Common people had to ask someone to carry their messages, and the letter might take several weeks to arrive, slower than the rainy season. That said, Henry VIII understood the importance of communication. He at times reformed the postal system to serve the court, laying the early foundations for what would become the Royal Mail. A way to ensure that when war broke out, or when he wanted to divorce for the third time, the message wouldn't arrive too late. Still awake if you imagine yourself riding in a jostling carriage under pouring rain, wearing a crumpled cloth hat, clutching your bag, and praying not to lose a wheel. And if you've drifted off, that's good too. Because whether Henry paved roads, taxed people to repair them, or passed laws banning drunk horseback riding, yes, that law existed, it all amounted to one thing: giving you a road to dream on. Sleep now. No shoes needed, no horse required, no dodging cow dung. You're traveling by imagination, a vehicle even Henry VIII couldn't control. And that is the gentlest way to travel in the 16th century. You've followed me down muddy roads, through chilling decrees, and into the scented chambers of power under Henry VIII. But tonight, if you're still lying there, breath soft as mist, it'll take you one level higher, not to a watchtower, but to a wide-angle view, the socio-economic landscape of England under Henry VIII. And you know what? If you ever thought economics was just banks and numbers in Tudor times, it was a matter of land, blood, sweat, and rye bread. When Henry took the throne in 1509, England was still a farming kingdom. About 80–85% of the population lived in rural areas, and most production depended on season's weather and luck. No machines, no crop insurance. A badly timed frost could turn an entire village into empty stomachs. Back then, economy meant having enough bread to survive the winter. Yet Henry VIII's reign marked a shift. Not because he loved economics, but because he needed money. A lot of money. For wars, for palaces, for weddings and divorces held like national ceremonies. And so Henry launched one of the most shocking economic reforms in English history: the dissolution of Catholic monasteries, the seizure of church property, and its sale to loyal nobles. Nearly a third of England's arable land changed hands in just a few years. Monasteries, once centers of healthcare education. Charity vanished. The poor lost their refuge. But the nobles, they gained land power and more reason to support the king. Economy under Henry's rule was a grand migration of land ownership from the church to the crown, and then to a rising class of landowners. And from that shift, a new class began to form: the gentry nobles without titles, but with land wealth and local influence. You can picture them like medieval land barons. They didn't need seats in parliament, but they had the power to steer an entire village toward Protestantism if they wished. And the lower classes, they remained peasants. But now, instead of working for monasteries, they worked for landlords. Low wages, high risk, especially as the enclosure movement spread. That is, common land once used for grazing farming was now fenced off, divided, and turned into private estates. The result: many were evicted, lost their livelihoods, and began to wander the country. It was a true social crisis. Because suddenly in major cities like London, York, and Norwich, waves of poor displaced people appeared, jobless, homeless, landless. And Henry, like many rulers in history, didn't think of welfare. He thought of laws. In 1531, the first poor law was enacted. Those without work or a master were deemed idle and could be whipped, forced into labor, or worse, branded on the face. A punishment that served as both warning and street decoration through fear. Do you feel a chill when an economy fails to create enough opportunity control becomes the instinct of power? And so, Tudor society began to stratify. The nobility grew richer, the commoners more desperate, and a middle-class merchants, small landowners, skilled craftsmen began to emerge. London, the largest city, started becoming the economic and social hub. Goods moved along the Thames, market streets popped up. Trade guilds formed early versions of unions. They controlled quality pricing and apprenticeships. And at the same time, they built quiet support networks for those who played by the rules. Scholars call this the pre-commercial phase. England wasn't industrialized yet, but the seeds of a market economy were sprouting from bakeries in Southwark to textile workshops in Norwich. And how did the people live through all this? They adapted. A farmer might plow fields and summer weave baskets in winter and build walls in spring. A mother could cook porridge, teach her daughter to sew, and sell eggs in the evening. Tudor society, under Henry's tight grip, became multitaskers, not out of talent, but out of fear of hunger. And the king, he continued to pour money into Hampton Court Palace, hosted days-long banquets, and funded life-sized portraits to immortalize a majestic ruler. Though by then, he could no longer ride a horse. Are you still lying there? Imagine yourself a blacksmith in Oxford in 1540. Each morning you hear the church bell. Your hands are calloused, your knees ache from cold, but you light the forge not out of passion, but because you have 2 children to feed. You know nothing of Parliament, nor why the village monastery was torn down. But you know the price of bread has gone up. And you know that if you stop working, hunger will come before sunrise. That was the socio-economic world under Henry VIII. A society torn apart and stitched back together by decrees. An economy booming in cities, unraveling in the countryside. A time when power shifted hands, land changed owners, and the people had to survive in the whirlwind of reform war and the oversized ego of a king. Sleep now. Henry did all this not because he understood economics, but because he understood power. But you, the one listening, you understand more society isn't built from gold or proclamations. It's built by the quiet hands of those who live, love, labor, and hope. And if you wake up tomorrow morning, smile, at least you don't have to pay a tax just to use a window. After trudging through muddy roads, iron-cold laws, and the boiling porridge pots of Tudor peasants now well turned down a smaller path. It's not paved, but it's lined with letters, illustrations, churches, and the gentle sound of a lute, the culture and education of England under Henry VIII. And if you think that culture back then was just Shakespeare spinning sonnets and noble women in wigs dancing in circles, you've jumped a bit ahead. Shakespeare wasn't born yet. And wigs, not quite in style. But don't worry, what you're about to hear is much more interesting. Let's start from the top, the royal court. Culture under Henry VIII was a strange fusion of Renaissance refinement and tight political control. Henry wasn't just a king who rode well and beheaded fast. He was also a musician, a poet, a composer of hymns and surprise, a capable scholar. He once wrote a book attacking Martin Luther and was awarded the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope. An ironic title considering just a few years later, he would sever ties with the very same Pope. Henry's court was like a grand stage where nobles had to dance, play music, recite Latin poetry, and if possible, write a theological essay or two. It wasn't about high-minded cultural ideals. It was about survival in a world where you never knew if tomorrow would bring you closer to the throne or to the chopping block. Want to gain favor? Write a flattering poem about the king. Strum a lute tune that reminded Henry of Jane Seymour. Or, at the very least, don't write anything that might make someone suspect you belonged to the wrong faith. And outside the palace, culture under Henry began seeping into the common classes, not through the internet, but through churches and printed books. Here came a major shift, the rise of printing technology. Before that, books were as rare as winter food. But by the late 15th century, Gutenberg's press had reached England. And under Henry's reign, thanks to his break with the church, the Bible was translated into English, no longer monopolized by Latin. The result: people began to read, understand, and question. Dangerous stuff. Because when folks read the Bible and found no verse saying the king could have 6 wives, they started thinking. But from that, a reading culture blossomed. People began sharing books. Small, cheap printed materials, pamphlets spread through the countryside, carrying news poetry, humorous folk songs, and sometimes fiery religious propaganda. Culture was no longer a luxury for nobles. It began knocking on the doors of common folk. And education. This is where Henry helped and harmed. Before he dissolved the monasteries, most of the school system, especially grammar schools, was run by the church. Monasteries were centers of bookkeeping, Latin instruction, math, and philosophy. But when he shut them down, hundreds of schools vanished. A cultural void stretched across decades. Fortunately, secular schools began to be rebuilt. Some major institutions still exist today, like King's School in Canterbury or Christ's Hospital, both with roots in reforms from Henry's time. Education back then wasn't for everyone. It was mostly for sons of well-off families. What did they study? Latin, logic, theology, a lot of rote memorization. No advanced mathematics, no soft skills. But if you were good, you could go to university. Oxford and Cambridge were like 2 academic sons back then. They trained priests, lawyers, royal clerks. If you got in, you could change your life. If not, well, the fields were still there. Women. Oh, they didn't attend official schools, but that doesn't mean they didn't learn. Many noble women were tutored at home in French music and basic theology enough to write letters, understand scripture, and become a deep wife. A rare few, like Elizabeth I, received a serious education and became true scholars. She spoke 6 languages fluently, culture under Henry. To be fair, was multi-layered, full of contradictions. The king loved art, but hated dissent. He encouraged learning, but executed those who used knowledge to question his authority. He allowed the Bible to be translated, but burned heretical books. He built libraries, but destroyed monasteries that held thousands of ancient manuscripts. You could call it a controlled renaissance. Culture was permitted if it served the king. Education was nurtured as long as it didn't make people think too far. And while King Henry composed music in his palace outside, stories were still told by word-of-mouth folk ballads, oral poems, legendary tales of kings, knights, and sometimes sly jabs at the crown. A kind of collective memory preserved not through books, but through voices around the evening fire. Can you hear it? A soft rhythm tapped with a spoon on a pot lid. A child reciting rhymes learned from their mother. A man singing a satirical song about Henry in a tavern, then falling silent when the door creaks open. That was Tudor culture. Not loud, not dazzling, but stubborn like moss clinging to stone. And you listening in the night, be grateful that today you can learn, read, and question without a hot iron branding your forehead. Sleep now. The books in Henry's time needed hours to be copied by hand. But your memory doesn't. It only needs a dream. Sleep well. And after all we've heard from wars, policies, laws, peasants, to muddy roads, and thick Latin textbooks. Perhaps you're asking, did Henry VIII actually do anything good? A fair question. And tonight, in this quiet space, he'll tell you about the true legacies of that infamous king. Not to excuse his 6 marriages or his cold executions, but to acknowledge sometimes even the most disruptive figures in history. Shake the world in ways we cannot ignore. Henry VIII's greatest legacy, without question, was breaking England away from the Roman Catholic Church. A decision that at first seemed merely a shortcut to divorce, but later became a monumental revolution in politics, society, and religion. By enacting the Act of Supremacy in 1534, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, ending the Pope's authority on English soil and placing the entire church system, its assets, and even the nation's faith under the Crown's control. It sounds authoritarian. But imagine for centuries before that the Catholic Church had the power to tax, issue legal rulings, meddle in politics, and even force a king to abdicate. Henry, by breaking away, carved a new path for a politically and religiously independent England. From there, English nationalism began to take distinct shape. People no longer saw themselves as part of a global religious empire, but as a separate nation with its own language, laws, and beliefs. And don't forget, thanks to this very act, the English Bible became widely accessible. For the first time, people could read the Word of God in their own language without a priest, without needing to know Latin. Henry didn't translate it, but he paved the way for knowledge to spread, and with it personal thought, a seed of freedom. What about governance? Henry VIII wasn't a democratic ruler, but he understood the importance of a modern government apparatus. Under his reign, the administrative system became more specialized than ever. Finance, domestic affairs, justice, foreign relations, each with its own office leadership and recorded documentation. This laid the groundwork for the professional civil service of modern Britain. Think kings manage everything themselves? Not really. Henry knew that to maintain power, he had to divide and control. So he didn't let one man grow too powerful. He created the Privy Council, where nobles shared responsibility and risk. A clever move copied by future monarchs. As for defense, though he spent money like water, Henry was the first to lay the foundation for the Royal Navy. He built dockyards, improved warship design, and created a naval arsenal system, which would later enable England to conquer oceans, expand its empire, and dominate global trade. If you've heard of Drake Raleigh or Nelson, remember they sailed on ships born from Henry VIII's maritime dream. And the legal system. Yes, many of his laws were terrifying, but his reign also saw the law becoming more codified and systematically recorded. No more verdicts based on gut feeling or oral tradition. Things began to be written down, a vital precursor to common law which would later spread to the US, Australia, and dozens of other countries. Can you see it now? A king full of contradictions, but also full of legacy. One who built and destroyed, who killed and enlightened, who oppressed and opened new paths. Here's a curious fact on his deathbed. Henry was still reviewing his will, checking over succession plans, guarding the structure of power with his last breath. That wasn't just control. It was political foresight beyond death. And that will created a long-lasting dynasty, with 3 children taking the throne in turn. Edward VI married Orphan Elizabeth I. Each, though vastly different, walked the path Henry VIII had cleared. You may not love him, but you can't deny without Henry. England might never have broken from the Pope, never had an English Bible, never built a powerful navy, never established common law, never had Elizabeth I, never inspired Shakespeare, never founded a future empire. He may not have planted the most beautiful seeds, but he dug the first trench where a future could grow. And you lying there in the night, let this thought drift gently like mist. Some people pass through history not leaving the scent of flowers, but shifting the wind itself. Sleep now. Henry VIII has long since slept. But the legacy he left still stirs in every line of law, every ship's sail, every book you hold in your hands. And so tonight you've traveled with me through an era both dazzling and dark, where a king with a crown barely big enough for his ego reshaped England with love, fear, and power. From muddy roads to deadly decrees, from courtly music to tavern whispers, everything in Henry VIII's reign wove glory and tragedy, hymn and blade. And if you're still awake, perhaps you've gently realized something: history isn't just grand events. Its small stories kept alive by those who choose to listen, like you tonight. Now, close your eyes. Let Henry, with his marriages, his wars, and even his compositions, fade into the past. And you drift into sleep sweeter than any king's. Sleep well. Tomorrow you still have a whole world waiting, and luckily you don't need a powdered wig to walk into it.